Hey guys, before we start tonight, I need you to do something. Think about the earliest memory you have. Maybe you're 3, maybe 4 years old. Now imagine that memory is the day everything safe in your world disappeared, and no one will tell you why. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this kind of storytelling is your thing. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'm always curious who's joining me for these late night deep dives into the past. Get comfortable. This one's going to stay with you. A little girl wakes up in a palace that's suddenly too quiet. She's 3 years old. Her mother is gone. Actually gone. Not travelling, not visiting, just erased. The servants won't say her name. The pretty dresses disappear. Even her title vanishes overnight. No one sits her down and explains that her father just had her mother's head cut off with a French sword, that he's already planning to marry someone else, that she's not a princess anymore, she's an inconvenience, a reminder, a living piece of evidence that needs to be managed. They just stop looking at her the same way, and she feels it. Even at 3 years old, she feels it. That little girl is Elizabeth, and what happened to her in those early years? The executions, the predator in her household, the imprisonment, the interrogations didn't just shape her, it built her, brick by brick, wall by wall, until the girl disappeared entirely and only the Queen remained. Tonight we're going behind the legend, behind the speeches and the Golden Age and the Virgin Queen mythology. We're going back to when she was just a kid, trying to survive in a world designed to destroy her. And I'm telling you right now, this is going to change how you see her. Because strength like hers doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from learning very young that everyone you love can be taken away, and that the only person you can ever truly rely on is yourself. So let's go back. Back to 1536. Back to the morning everything changed. Back to the day a 3-year-old girl stopped being a princess and started learning how to survive. May 19th, 1536. A little girl wakes up in a palace that suddenly feels too quiet. She's 2 years old, maybe almost 3, too young to understand why the servants won't look her in the eyes, too young to know that her mother's head was just severed from her body with a French sword. Her name is Elizabeth, and today she stopped being a princess. No one told her, not directly. How do you explain to a toddler that her father ordered her mother's execution? That the Queen, the woman who gave birth to her, was just killed for crimes she probably didn't commit? You don't. You just stop calling her Your Grace. You move her to a smaller room. You take away the fine dresses. You whisper when she walks by. And you hope she's too young to remember. She wasn't. This is the story of Elizabeth I. But before she was the Virgin Queen, before she was good Queen Bess, before she became one of the greatest monarchs England ever knew, she was a little girl learning that everyone she loved could die at her father's command. That safety was an illusion. That survival required silence. Tonight, we're not talking about her reign. We're talking about how she survived long enough to have one. And I promise you, it's darker than anything you learned in school. So settle in. This is going to take a while. Let's start with the execution. Because everything that follows, every choice Elizabeth made, every wall she built around herself, every calculated move during her 45-year reign starts here, in the courtyard of the Tower of London. With her mother kneeling in the grass, Anne Boleyn woke up that morning knowing she would die. She'd spent the last 2 weeks imprisoned in the Tower, accused of adultery, incest, treason, and witchcraft. The charges were absurd. Everyone knew it. Anne knew it. King Henry VIII knew it. But Henry wanted her dead. And what Henry wanted, Henry got. Anne had committed one unforgivable sin. She'd failed to give him a son. She'd given him Elizabeth instead, a daughter. Useless in Henry's eyes. A disappointment wrapped in silk. And after Elizabeth, Anne had suffered miscarriages. One stillborn son. Another pregnancy lost after Henry had a jousting accident, and Anne, terrified he would die, miscarried in shock. Henry blamed her. For everything. For not being the son-producing machine he needed. For being too opinionated, too sharp-tongued, too unwilling to play the submissive wife. Anne Boleyn had clawed her way from minor nobility to queen. She'd made Henry break with Rome, dissolve his first marriage, and turn England upside down just to marry her. And now he wanted her gone. The night before her execution, Anne asked for a French swordsman instead of an axe. A small mercy. Swords were faster, cleaner, less painful. Henry granted this final request, probably because he wanted the whole thing over with quickly. Wanted to move on to his next wife, Jane Seymour, who was already waiting in the wings, probably picking out curtains for the Queen's chambers. Anne dressed carefully that morning, a grey damask gown trimmed with fur, her hair pinned up under a simple English hood. No crown, no jewels, just a woman preparing to die with whatever dignity she could muster. She walked to the scaffold around 8 in the morning. A small crowd had gathered, mostly nobility. Courtiers who'd smiled at her just weeks ago, who'd bowed, who'd called her Your Majesty. Now they watched like it was entertainment. A morning's diversion before breakfast. Anne climbed the scaffold. The platform was covered in straw to soak up the blood. She looked out at the crowd and gave a short speech. Protocol required it. Even in death there were rules. She didn't proclaim her innocence. Couldn't. That would be treason against the king's judgment. Instead, she praised Henry, called him a merciful and gentle prince, said she came there to die according to law, that she didn't accuse anyone, didn't blame anyone. It was a masterclass in saying nothing while appearing to say everything, a skill her daughter would perfect. Then Anne knelt. The swordsman stood behind her. She removed her hood herself, tucked her hair back so her neck was exposed, clear, easy. She knelt in the straw and began to pray. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. The swordsman moved quietly, professionally. Anne never saw the blade. One stroke, clean, fast. Her head separated from her body and fell into the straw. The crowd watched in silence, then dispersed, casual, like they'd just watched a play. Anne Boleyn's body was shoved into an old arrow chest, no coffin, no ceremony, and buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower Chapel. No funeral, no monument, just gone. And her daughter? Elizabeth was at Hunsdon, one of the royal residences, probably playing with toys or being read to by a servant, completely unaware that her mother had just been murdered by her father. But she would feel it, in the days that followed, in the sudden change, in the way people looked at her, or rather, stopped looking at her, because Elizabeth wasn't a princess anymore. She was a bastard, the daughter of an executed traitor, an inconvenience, a reminder of Henry's second marriage, the one he now pretended had never been valid. If the marriage wasn't valid, then Elizabeth wasn't legitimate, wasn't royal, wasn't anything. Just a little girl no one knew what to do with. Imagine being her. You're 2 years old, your world is warm and safe and full of people who smile at you. You're dressed in beautiful clothes. You sleep in a soft bed. You're called princess. You're important. And then, overnight, everything changes. The smiles disappear. The nice clothes vanish. You're moved to smaller rooms. The servants who used to fawn over you now avoid eye contact. No one explains why. No one tells you what's happening. You're just less, suddenly, inexplicably. And somewhere deep in your child's brain, you understand that something terrible has happened. You don't know what, but you feel it. In the silence, in the absence, in the way people whisper your name now, like it's something shameful. Your mother is gone. You don't remember her face. You were too young when they took you away from her, but you feel the hole where she used to be, the emptiness that no one will explain. And you learn your first lesson, the most important lesson of your life. Love is not safety, power is not protection, and everyone can be taken away. Let's talk about what happened next, because Elizabeth's childhood wasn't just one trauma, it was a series of them, each one teaching her new lessons about survival, about silence, about how to be invisible when you needed to be, and unforgettable when it mattered. After Anne's execution, Elizabeth was sent to live in various royal residences, shuffled around like an unwanted piece of furniture. She had a governess, Cat Ashley, who loved her fiercely, and a tutor, William Grindal, who recognised her intelligence early and pushed her hard. Elizabeth was brilliant, frighteningly so. By the time she was 6, she could read and write. By 11, she was fluent in 6 languages: English, Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, and Greek. She studied theology, history, philosophy, mathematics. She practiced her handwriting until it was perfect, studied rhetoric until she could argue circles around grown men. Education became her armour. Knowledge became her weapon. Because she understood, even as a child, that she had no other power, no title, no money, no claim to anything except what she could prove through her mind. But intelligence alone wouldn't keep her safe. Not in Henry's court, not in a world where kings could execute their wives on a whim and bastardize their children with a stroke of a pen. Henry remarried quickly. 11 days after Anne's execution, he married Jane Seymour. Sweet, docile Jane. Everything Anne wasn't. She lasted just over a year before dying in childbirth, but not before giving Henry what he wanted: a son, Edward. Suddenly Elizabeth had a baby brother, a legitimate heir, which made Elizabeth even more irrelevant, just the bastard daughter of a dead traitor, the girl who reminded Henry of his mistakes. Then Henry married again, and again, and again. Anne of Cleves, a political match that Henry hated on sight. He called her a Flanders mare and had the marriage annulled within 6 months. Elizabeth met her briefly. Anne was kind, practical, smart enough to agree to the annulment without a fight, which probably saved her life. Then came Catherine Howard, young, pretty, and catastrophically stupid. She was probably 16 when she married Henry, who was 49, obese and suffering from a leg ulcer that never healed and smelled like rotting meat. Catherine cheated on him. Or maybe she was assaulted by Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry's courtiers. Or maybe she'd had relationships before her marriage that she didn't disclose. The truth is murky. What's clear is that Henry found out, and in 1542, Catherine Howard was executed, just like Anne Boleyn. Another queen, another head, another woman who'd failed to navigate Henry's world successfully. Elizabeth was 8 years old when Catherine Howard died, old enough to understand what execution meant, old enough to feel the pattern forming. Queens die, women die, one wrong move and you're kneeling in the straw. Finally, Henry married Catherine Parr, wife number 6, a twice-widowed noblewoman who was intelligent, educated, and savvy enough to survive Henry's final years. She was kind to Elizabeth, brought her back to court, made sure she had tutors, treated her like she mattered. For the first time in years, Elizabeth had something resembling stability, a stepmother who cared, a place at court, a sense of belonging. She should have known it wouldn't last, because nothing good ever did. Let's talk about Thomas Seymour, because this is where Elizabeth's childhood gets truly dark, where the lessons she learned stopped being about politics and started being about survival of a different kind. Catherine Parr was a kind stepmother. She was also deeply in love with Thomas Seymour, the uncle of the young King Edward VI and brother to Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. Thomas was ambitious, charming, and dangerous, the kind of man who saw opportunity everywhere and had no problem exploiting it. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, Catherine was finally free to marry the man she wanted. Within months, scandalously fast, she married Thomas Seymour in secret, and Elizabeth, now 13 years old, came to live with them at their household. It started small, playful, innocent, if you wanted to believe it was innocent. Thomas would come into Elizabeth's bedroom in the mornings, early, before she was dressed. He'd be wearing only his nightshirt, basically underwear. He'd pull back her bed curtains, slap her on the back or the buttocks, familiarly, tickle her, and sometimes try to kiss her. Elizabeth would shrink into the bedclothes, try to make herself small, invisible, but Thomas would laugh, keep going, like it was a game. Kat Ashley, Elizabeth's governess, was horrified. She told Thomas to stop, told him it was inappropriate, told him people would talk. He ignored her. Sometimes Catherine Parr would join in. She'd hold Elizabeth down, while Thomas tickled her or cut her dress to ribbons with a pair of scissors, while Elizabeth was still wearing it. Catherine laughing, Thomas laughing, Elizabeth trapped between them, not laughing at all. Was Catherine trying to protect Elizabeth by being present? Was she trying to convince herself this was just innocent fun? Or was she complicit? We'll never know. What we know is that it happened, regularly, for months, and then it escalated. Thomas started coming to Elizabeth's room, alone, without Catherine. He'd let himself in early in the morning. Sometimes Elizabeth would already be awake, reading or studying. Sometimes she'd still be in bed. He'd sit with her, talk to her, get too close. Kat Ashley tried to intervene. She started sleeping in Elizabeth's room or nearby where she could hear if Thomas tried to enter. She locked doors. She warned Elizabeth to be careful, to never be alone with him. But Thomas was clever. He had keys. He had authority in his own household, and he was the Queen's husband. What could a governess really do? At some point, we don't know exactly when or how, someone caught them, or nearly caught them, or heard something. The details are fuzzy because everyone involved had reasons to lie. But what's clear is that in May 1548, Elizabeth was abruptly removed from Catherine Parr's household and sent to live elsewhere. Catherine was pregnant. She gave birth in August 1548 to a daughter, Mary. And then a week later, Catherine Parr died of childbed fever. She was 36 years old. Elizabeth wrote a letter of condolence to Thomas Seymour. It was formal, cold, proper, nothing more. And then Thomas Seymour made his move, the one that would get him killed. With Catherine dead, Thomas was free, and he had plans, big plans. He wanted power, wanted to marry into royalty, wanted to control the young King Edward, his nephew, who was only 10 years old and technically ruling England under the guidance of regents and advisors. Thomas started making inquiries about marrying Elizabeth. She was 15 now, illegitimate technically, but still Henry's daughter, still valuable, still a pawn he could use. He asked around the court, floated the idea, tried to gauge support. He even tried to get Edward's permission, visiting the young king secretly at night, bribing servants to let him in. But the Regency Council, led by Thomas's own brother, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, heard about it, and they arrested him. In January 1549, Thomas Seymour was charged with 33 counts of treason, including trying to marry Elizabeth without the council's permission, trying to kidnap the king, trying to overthrow the government. And Elizabeth, she was interrogated, repeatedly, by Thomas Parry, her cofferer, and Kat Ashley, her governess, who were arrested and questioned separately. They wanted to know what had happened in Catherine Parr's household, what Thomas had done, what Elizabeth had said, whether she'd agreed to marry him. Elizabeth was 15 years old, alone, terrified. Everyone she trusted had been taken away, and she knew that one wrong answer could mean her death, so she said nothing. Not nothing exactly. She answered carefully, strategically. She admitted Thomas had visited her room, but said it was always innocent, said Kat had been present, said she'd never agreed to marry him, said she barely knew him at all. She lied, convincingly, calmly, with the kind of control most adults never master. And it worked. She wasn't charged, wasn't arrested, just watched, carefully, for the rest of Edward's reign. Thomas Seymour wasn't so lucky. He was executed in March 1549, beheaded on Tower Hill. Another man who'd reached too high, another body added to the pile, and Elizabeth learned another lesson, one she'd carry for the rest of her life. Men are dangerous, trust is fatal, and survival requires saying exactly what people want to hear, while revealing absolutely nothing true. She was 15 years old, and she'd just survived her second brush with execution, this time her own. It wouldn't be the last. Let's talk about what this did to her. Not psychologically. We're not armchair diagnosing a 16th century monarch, but practically. How these experiences shaped the choices she made, the person she became. By the time Elizabeth was 15, she'd watched 2 queens executed, watched her father marry and discard 6 wives, watched a man who'd molested her get beheaded for trying to marry her. She'd been interrogated by government officials. She'd seen her servants arrested. She'd been stripped of her title, then partially restored, then watched again. She'd learned that safety didn't exist, that love was a weapon, that marriage was a trap, that men wanted one of 2 things from her: power through her claim to the throne, or her body, often both. And she'd learned that the only way to survive was to be smarter than everyone else, more careful, more controlled, more willing to lie convincingly and wait patiently and strike only when the moment was perfect. She stopped being a child, not gradually, abruptly. The moment Thomas Seymour was arrested, Elizabeth transformed. No more playful innocence, no more trust, just cold, calculating survival. She dressed modestly, severely, all black or simple colours, high necklines, no ornamentation. She wanted to look like a scholar, not a woman. Not a temptation, not a threat. She studied harder, pushed herself further, wrote letters in perfect Latin to impress the Regency Council, translated religious texts, proved she was serious, intellectual, not some frivolous girl who could be married off and forgotten. And she waited, because Edward VI was sickly. Everyone could see it. He'd been a fragile child, and he wasn't getting stronger, which meant the succession was uncertain, which meant Elizabeth needed to be ready. But careful. So careful. Because one wrong move and she'd end up like her mother, like Catherine Howard, like Thomas Seymour. Just another body. Another person who'd reached for power and found the blade instead. Edward VI died in July 1553. He was 15 years old. He'd tried to change the succession before he died, to cut out his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and name Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his heir. It was a desperate attempt to keep England Protestant, keep power away from Mary, who was Catholic and would almost certainly try to return England to Rome. It didn't work. Jane Grey lasted 9 days before Mary rallied support and took the throne. Jane was arrested and would eventually be executed, another young woman ground up in the machinery of Tudor politics. And Elizabeth had stayed completely out of it, hadn't supported Jane, hadn't supported Mary, hadn't done anything except wait quietly at her estate, studying Latin and pretending she had no interest in politics whatsoever. It was the smart move, because Mary I became queen, and Mary was Catholic, devout, determined to undo everything her father and brother had done, determined to return England to the Catholic Church. And Elizabeth was Protestant, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the symbol of everything Mary hated, the living reminder of the woman who'd replaced Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. Mary didn't trust Elizabeth. How could she? Elizabeth was the daughter of the woman who'd I destroyed Mary's family, the daughter of Henry's great sin. And more importantly, Elizabeth was next in line for the throne, a permanent threat, a rival who couldn't be ignored. At first, Mary tried to be magnanimous. She summoned Elizabeth to court, treated her kindly, at least publicly, but she also pressured Elizabeth to convert to Catholicism, to attend Mass, to renounce her Protestant faith. Elizabeth went to Mass, not enthusiastically, not convincingly, but she went. She played the role, said the right words, bowed at the right moments, while privately keeping her Protestant chaplain and her Protestant books and her Protestant beliefs hidden away where Mary's spies couldn't find them. She was walking a tightrope again, trying to seem Catholic enough to not be arrested while staying Protestant enough to keep her base of support, trying to be visible enough that people remembered she existed while being invisible enough that Mary didn't see her as a threat. It was exhausting, constant, every word measured, every gesture calculated, every day a performance where one wrong line could mean death. And then, in January 1554, everything fell apart. Thomas Wyatt the Younger led a rebellion. Not against Mary specifically, or so he claimed. Against her planned marriage to Philip II of Spain. Mary had announced she would marry Philip, the heir to the Spanish throne, which terrified English Protestants. Spain was aggressively Catholic. This marriage could mean Spanish control of England, could mean the Inquisition, could mean Protestant burnings. So Wyatt gathered an army, marched toward London, nearly reached the city before Mary's forces stopped him. It was chaos, terrifying, the kind of rebellion that could topple a queen if it succeeded, and Mary was furious, paranoid, determined to root out every traitor and sympathiser. And Elizabeth, she'd been at her estate, Ashridge, staying out of sight, staying quiet, doing absolutely nothing that could be construed as supporting Wyatt. But Wyatt had written to her, tried to contact her, and some of his supporters had mentioned her name, said they were fighting for Elizabeth, said that if Mary fell, Elizabeth should be queen. Elizabeth hadn't asked for this, hadn't encouraged it, hadn't even responded to Wyatt's letters. But it didn't matter. Her name was connected, and that was enough. In February 1554, Mary sent for Elizabeth, ordered her to come to court immediately. Elizabeth was ill. She wrote back saying she was too sick to travel. It wasn't a complete lie, she was probably terrified, which can make you physically ill. But Mary didn't care. She sent her own doctors to examine Elizabeth. They confirmed she was sick but said she could travel in a litter. So Elizabeth was carried to London, slowly, painfully, taking 2 weeks for a journey that should have taken 3 days. She knew what was waiting for her, knew that once she reached London, she might never leave. She was taken to Whitehall, palace but kept under guard, not officially arrested, not officially accused, just detained. While Mary's council questioned Wyatt and his supporters, while they looked for evidence that Elizabeth had been involved, they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Elizabeth had been too careful, too smart. She'd stayed completely out of it. But Mary didn't need evidence. She needed Elizabeth gone, needed the threat eliminated, needed to stop looking over her shoulder at the younger, Protestant, increasingly popular half-sister who could rally support just by existing. On March 18, 1554, Elizabeth was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same place her mother had been executed 18 years earlier. She knew what the Tower meant. Everyone did. You went to the Tower to await trial or execution. Often there was no trial, just a few days or weeks of captivity, and then the blade. Elizabeth was terrified. She begged to be allowed to write to Mary, to explain, to plead her case. They refused at first, but Elizabeth was insistent, desperate, so they gave her paper. She wrote carefully, beautifully, in her perfect handwriting. She reminded Mary that she was innocent, that she'd never conspired with Wyatt, that she'd always been loyal. She begged Mary not to let her be condemned without a fair hearing, and she dragged out the letter, writing diagonally across the remaining space to use up as much time as possible, because every minute she spent writing was a minute she wasn't in the Tower. It didn't work. The letter is famous now, called the Tide Letter, because Elizabeth deliberately delayed so long that by the time she finished, the tide had changed, and they couldn't take her by barge that day. She bought herself a few extra hours, maybe one more night of relative safety. But the next day, she was taken to the Tower. She entered through the Traitors' Gate, the water entrance used for prisoners. As she stepped onto the stone landing, she reportedly sat down and refused to move. Said she was no traitor, said she shouldn't be there, that she was the king's daughter, Henry's daughter, and deserved better. Her guards waited. Eventually, she stood. She walked up the stairs, into the tower, into a set of rooms where she would spend the next 2 months, not knowing if she would ever walk out alive. Thomas Wyatt was executed, beheaded. Before he died, he publicly cleared Elizabeth, said she'd had nothing to do with the rebellion, said he'd acted alone. It should have been enough. It wasn't. Mary's advisors wanted Elizabeth dead, wanted her gone, wanted the threat eliminated permanently. They pressured Mary to sign a death warrant, to just be done with it. Mary hesitated, not out of love, not out of mercy, but out of political calculation. Elizabeth was popular, especially among Protestants. Executing her without clear evidence could trigger more rebellions, could make Elizabeth a martyr, could destabilise Mary's already shaky reign. So, Mary did nothing, left Elizabeth in the tower, let her sit, let her wait, let her fear eat her alive. Elizabeth spent 2 months in those rooms, not tortured, not mistreated exactly, but isolated, under constant watch, never knowing when the guards would come to take her to the scaffold. She walked in the Tower gardens sometimes, under guard. She saw the place where her mother had been executed, saw the chapel where Anne Boleyn was buried in an unmarked grave, saw the walls where other prisoners, including Thomas Wyatt, had been held before their deaths. And she waited, because that's all she could do, wait and hope that Mary's political calculation held, that Mary decided keeping her alive was safer than killing her. In May 1554, Elizabeth was released from the Tower. Not freed, moved, to Woodstock, a royal manor in Oxfordshire, where she was kept under house arrest, still a prisoner, still watched, but alive. She stayed at Woodstock for nearly a year, guarded by Sir Henry Bedingfield, a loyal Catholic who took his job seriously. He read her mail, monitored her visitors, reported everything she said or did to Mary's council. Elizabeth was 21 years old. She'd survived the Tower, but she wasn't safe, not even close. As long as Mary was queen, as long as Elizabeth was the Protestant heir, she was in danger. So she kept her head down, kept studying, kept writing perfect letters to Mary, expressing loyalty and devotion, kept pretending she had no interest in the throne whatsoever. And she waited, again, because waiting was what she did best, waiting and surviving, and eventually it paid off. Mary married Philip of Spain in July 1554. It was deeply unpopular. The English people hated it, hated the idea of a foreign Catholic king, hated Spain, hated Philip. Mary didn't care. She loved Philip, or thought she did, desperately wanted him to love her back, desperately wanted to give him an heir, a Catholic heir who would secure England's return to Rome. She had several false pregnancies. Her body would swell. Her periods would stop. She'd feel movement in her belly. The court would celebrate, prepare for a royal birth. And then, nothing. No baby, just Mary's body betraying her, again and again. It was tragic, genuinely. Mary was in her late 30s. She'd spent most of her life unmarried, waiting for a chance to rule. Now she was queen, married, and her body wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't give her the one thing she needed to secure her legacy. Meanwhile, Philip was bored. He spent as little time in England as possible, went back to Spain, left Mary alone. She wrote him desperate letters begging him to return. He mostly ignored them, and Mary, heartbroken and increasingly paranoid, turned her attention to burning Protestants. She started slowly. A few high-profile heretics, theologians, bishops who'd supported Edward's Protestant reforms. But then it escalated. Between 1555 and 1558, Mary burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. Men and women, old and young, people who refused to recant their faith. The burnings were public, meant to be warnings, meant to terrify people back into Catholicism. Instead, they created martyrs, made Mary look cruel. earned her the nickname Bloody Mary that would follow her forever. And Elizabeth? Elizabeth stayed quiet, Protestant in private, carefully neutral in public. She attended Mass when required. She said nothing about the burnings. She expressed loyalty to Mary at every opportunity. She was playing the longest game of her life, waiting for Mary to die, because Mary was sick, had been for years. Her false pregnancies weren't just psychological, they were symptoms of something wrong. Possibly ovarian cysts, possibly cancer. We'll never know exactly. But she was dying, and everyone knew it, including Mary. By 1558, Mary was too ill to deny it any longer. She'd failed to produce an heir. Philip had abandoned her. Her attempt to restore Catholicism was making her hated, and Elizabeth, Protestant, popular, young Elizabeth, was going to inherit the throne. Mary hated it, hated knowing that everything she'd worked for would be undone the moment she died, hated that Elizabeth would probably restore Protestantism, hated that her father's bastard daughter would succeed where she'd failed. But there was nothing she could do. Elizabeth was the legal heir. Parliament supported her. The people supported her. Mary could have ordered her execution, but it would have caused civil war, and Mary was too sick to fight. So Mary did the only thing she could. She made Elizabeth swear, that she would protect the Catholic faith, that she wouldn't persecute Catholics, that she'd allow them to practice their religion. Elizabeth promised, said all the right things, swore loyalty, swore she'd do everything Mary asked. She was lying, or at least she was saying what she needed to say to survive. Again. On November 17th, 1558, Mary I died at St. James's Palace. She was 42 years old. Her last words were reportedly about her husband, Philip, and the Mass. She died alone, unloved, and knowing her life's work would be erased. And Elizabeth was at Hatfield House, her estate, when the news arrived. The council came to her, knelt, called her Your Majesty. She was 25 years old. She'd survived 2 queens, 3 stepmothers, multiple interrogations, imprisonment in the Tower, house arrest, accusations of treason, a predator in her household, her mother's execution, her father's rage. She'd survived everything the Tudor court could throw at her. And now, finally, she was queen. Her first words as queen were reportedly in Latin. A domino factum est illud, et est mirabile in oculis nostris. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. She didn't cry, didn't celebrate, didn't show relief or fear or anything except perfect calculated composure. Because Elizabeth had learned long ago that showing emotion was dangerous, that vulnerability was fatal, that survival meant control, always control. She'd spent her entire life preparing for this moment, learning how to survive in a world designed to destroy her, learning how to be smarter, quieter, more patient than everyone else, learning how to play the game better than anyone had ever played it before. And now she was queen, and everything she'd survived, every trauma, every betrayal, every moment of terror, had taught her exactly how to rule. Not with love, with strategy, not with trust, with calculation, not with hope, with survival. Let's talk about what happened next. Not her entire reign. That's another story for another night. But those early years, those first crucial months and years where Elizabeth had to prove she could actually do this, that she wasn't just Anne Boleyn's bastard daughter, that she was a queen. She moved carefully, deliberately. The first thing she did was assemble a council, but not the kind of council Mary had, full of old Catholic nobles who'd spent the entire reign fighting each other. Elizabeth chose differently. She kept a few of Mary's advisors, the ones who were competent and willing to accept religious change, and she brought in new people, people she trusted, people like William Cecil, who would serve as her Secretary of State and closest advisor for the next 40 years. Cecil was brilliant, cautious, Protestant, but not fanatically so. He understood politics, understood that England was broke, divided, and exhausted from constant religious upheaval. He and Elizabeth thought alike. Both preferred stability over ideology. Both were willing to compromise when necessary. Together, they crafted what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. It was a compromise, a middle path. England would be Protestant, officially. The Book of Common Prayer would return. Churches would use English, not Latin. Clergy could marry, but Elizabeth would be called Supreme Governor of the Church, not Supreme Head, like her father. A subtle distinction that made her authority seem less absolute, less offensive to Catholics, and Catholics would be allowed to practice their faith privately, as long as they didn't cause trouble, as long as they attended Anglican services occasionally, as long as they kept quiet. It wasn't perfect. It satisfied almost no one completely. Hardcore Protestants wanted more reform. Catholics wanted Rome. But it worked. It kept England from descending into religious war like France and the Netherlands were experiencing. Elizabeth understood something crucial, something her sister Mary had missed. You can't force people to believe. You can force them to conform publicly, but their private beliefs will remain. And if you push too hard, they'll rebel. So she didn't push. She created a system where people could believe what they wanted privately, as long as they behaved publicly. It wasn't tolerance in the modern sense. It was pragmatic management of an impossible situation. And it worked. For 45 years, England remained relatively stable. No massive rebellions, no religious wars, just a slow, careful, managed transition from Catholic to Protestant that didn't tear the country apart. But let's talk about marriage, because everyone expected Elizabeth to marry. It was unthinkable that a woman would rule alone. Queens were supposed to be wife and mother first, ruler second. Elizabeth was 25 and unmarried. Deeply unusual, bordering on scandalous. The council started pushing immediately. She needed to marry, needed to produce an heir, needed to secure the succession. It was her duty, her responsibility, her obligation as queen. Elizabeth listened, smiled, agreed that yes, marriage was important, and then she did absolutely nothing about it. Suitors came forward, lots of them. Philip II of Spain, her dead sister's husband, offered to marry her. Elizabeth politely declined. She had no interest in becoming Spain's puppet. Various European princes and dukes were suggested. Swedish, Austrian, French. Elizabeth entertained the proposals, asked questions, dragged out negotiations, and never committed. The council grew frustrated. Why wouldn't she just choose someone? Anyone? England needed an heir. She was getting older. Time was running out. But Elizabeth had no intention of marrying. Not really. Not ever. Because she'd learned what marriage meant. She'd watched her father marry 6 times, watched him control, diminish, and sometimes murder his wives. She'd watched Mary become desperate and broken, trying to please Philip. She'd watched marriage turn powerful women into property. And she'd experienced firsthand what happened when men had access to a young woman's body. Thomas Seymour had taught her that lesson well. Elizabeth understood that marriage would end her power. A husband would rule for her, make decisions for her, control her. She'd be Queen of England in name only. The real power would belong to her husband. She'd spent her entire life fighting to survive, to claim power, to reach the throne. And everyone expected her to just hand that power to a man. Because that's what proper women did? No. Absolutely not. But she couldn't just say that. Couldn't announce she had no intention of marrying. That would cause panic. Parliament would rebel. The council would conspire. Foreign powers would assume England was weak and vulnerable. So she lied, brilliantly. For decades, she entertained suitors, flirted, sent encouraging signals. Let men think they had a chance. She dragged out negotiations until the suitor got tired or died or married someone else. Then she'd express sadness that it hadn't worked out and move on to the next candidate. Her council begged. Her parliament petitioned. Foreign ambassadors pressured. and Elizabeth just smiled and said maybe. Soon, when the time is right, when the situation is favourable, when God wills it, she turned marriage proposals into diplomatic tools, used them to keep foreign powers guessing, to maintain alliances without actually committing to anything, to play Spain against France, against Scotland, against Austria. It was masterful, infuriating to everyone involved, but masterful. And when people pushed too hard, she'd explode. There are records of her shouting at Parliament, at ambassadors, at anyone who dared tell her she had to marry. She was queen. She would decide, and she'd decided no. Instead, she created a cult of personality around her virginity. She became the Virgin Queen, married to England, mother to her people, wedded to duty, not a man. It was propaganda, brilliant, effective propaganda, but it worked. It turned her unmarried status from a weakness into a strength, from a scandal into a virtue, and it kept her powerful. Because as long as she remained unmarried, she remained in control. No husband to override her, no man to take credit for her successes. Just Elizabeth, alone at the top, exactly where she'd fought her entire life to be. But let's be clear, this wasn't easy. This wasn't some feminist statement or act of defiance for its own sake. This was survival. This was Elizabeth looking at the world she lived in, a world that destroyed powerful women, and finding the one narrow path that let her keep her power. And that path required her to be alone, to never trust anyone completely, to never let anyone get close enough to hurt her, to build walls so high and so thick that no one could see the person underneath. She'd learned as a child that everyone could be taken away. That love was dangerous, that vulnerability meant death, so she eliminated vulnerability, turned herself into an icon, a symbol, something untouchable. But inside those walls, inside that carefully constructed persona, she was still the little girl whose mother had been murdered, who'd been molested by her stepmother's husband, who'd sat in the tower not knowing if tomorrow would be her last day. She was still that girl, but no one would ever see her again. Let's talk about Robert Dudley. Because if Elizabeth came close to loving anyone, it was him. And even that relationship was complicated, strategic, and ultimately impossible. Robert Dudley was the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the man who'd tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, which meant Robert's family was tainted. His father had been executed for treason. His family's lands and titles had been stripped. But Robert and Elizabeth had known each other since childhood. They'd been imprisoned in the Tower at the same time during Mary's reign. They'd survived together. And there was something between them. Affection, chemistry, maybe even love, if Elizabeth was capable of that. When Elizabeth became queen, she made Robert master of the horse, a position that kept him close to her, near her at all times. And people noticed the way she looked at him, the way they spoke to each other, the time they spent together. Rumours started immediately. Elizabeth and Robert were lovers. They were having an affair. They were probably sleeping together. The court whispered. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments. Everyone watched and speculated. Robert was married to Amy Robsart. They'd married young before Robert's family fell from power. But Amy lived in the country. Robert lived at court. And his relationship with the Queen was clearly more than professional. In September 1560, Amy Robsart died. She was found at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place, her neck broken. It looked like an accident. But the timing was suspicious, convenient. If Robert was a widower, he could marry Elizabeth. They could be together legitimately. Immediately, everyone assumed murder. Robert must have killed her, or had her killed, so he could marry the Queen. The scandal exploded. Ambassadors wrote home saying Elizabeth was finished, that she'd lost all credibility, that she couldn't possibly marry Robert now without confirming everyone's suspicions. An inquest was held. It ruled Amy's death an accident, but no one believed it. The rumours never stopped. For the rest of Elizabeth's reign, People whispered that she and Robert had murdered his wife. We don't know what really happened. Amy might have fallen. She'd been ill, possibly with breast cancer, which could have caused bone fragility. The fall might have been genuine, or it might have been suicide or murder. We'll never know. What we know is that Elizabeth couldn't marry Robert after that. Not without destroying her reputation completely, not without looking like a murderer, so she didn't. But she kept him close, gave him titles, made him Earl of Leicester, gave him lands, money, power, kept him at court, let him be her favourite, her companion, her almost husband. People assumed they were sleeping together. Maybe they were. Probably they weren't. Elizabeth was too careful, too controlled, too aware that one pregnancy would destroy everything. But she loved him, in whatever way Elizabeth could love anyone. She kept his letters. She visited him when he was sick. She mourned him genuinely when he died in 1588, just after the Spanish Armada. Robert Dudley was the man Elizabeth might have married in a different world, a different life, if she'd been born a man, or born powerless, or born in a time when marriage didn't mean surrender, but she wasn't. So she kept him close and kept him impossible. And when he secretly married Lettice Knollys in 1578, Elizabeth's cousin, Elizabeth was furious, hurt, betrayed. She banished Lettice from court permanently, never forgave her, but she eventually forgave Robert, because she needed him, because he was useful, because in her own way she cared about him, but not enough to marry him, not enough to give up her power, because power was all she had, all she'd ever fought for, all that mattered in the end. Elizabeth's court became legendary, a place of culture, art, poetry, and intrigue. She surrounded herself with intelligent people, writers like Edmund Spenser and Christopher Marlowe, adventurers like Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, politicians like Francis Walsingham, her spy master, who built an intelligence network that kept her safe from assassination plots. She encouraged learning, spoke multiple languages fluently, debated theology with bishops, read voraciously. She wanted her court to rival the great courts of Europe, to prove that England, small, cold, rainy England, could produce culture and power, and she controlled everything, every appointment, every decision, every shilling spent. She read every major policy document herself, questioned everything, trusted no one completely. She had favourites, Robert Dudley, later Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, younger men who amused her, who flirted with her, who made her feel desirable. But she never let them have real power, not the kind that could threaten her. She'd learned that lesson too well. Men wanted power, men took power when you let your guard down, so she never did. Essex learned that lesson the hard way. He was brilliant, charming, and arrogant. Elizabeth adored him. But when he tried to leverage her affection into real political power, when he defied her orders, made unauthorized decisions, and eventually led a failed rebellion, she had him executed. In 1601, near the end of her reign, she was 67 years old, and she still wouldn't tolerate betrayal, still wouldn't let affection cloud her judgment, still wouldn't let anyone think they could control her. Essex's execution hurt her. Genuinely, she'd loved him in her way, but she did it anyway, because survival required it, because power required it, because she'd learned as a child that sentiment was dangerous and control was everything. As Elizabeth aged, the question of succession became urgent. She had no children, no heir. She refused to name one, because naming an heir was dangerous. It created a rival, someone for malcontents to rally around, someone who might get impatient and decide to take the throne early. So Elizabeth just didn't. Refused to discuss it, refused to plan for it, refused to acknowledge that she was mortal and would eventually die. It was maddening to her council, to Parliament, to everyone who worried about civil war after her death. But Elizabeth didn't care. Or rather, she cared more about maintaining power in the present than planning for a future she wouldn't see. The obvious heir was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, whom Elizabeth had reluctantly executed in 1587 after decades of imprisonment and multiple assassination plots. James had a legitimate claim through Henry VII. He was Protestant, he was already a king, he made sense, but Elizabeth wouldn't confirm it, wouldn't give James the satisfaction of knowing he'd inherit, kept him guessing, kept him nervous, right up until the end. In 1603, Elizabeth got sick. She'd always been healthy, rarely ill, but she was 70 years old, and her body was finally giving up. She developed a throat infection, stopped eating, grew weak. Her advisors begged her to go to bed. She refused, said that if she lay down, she'd never get up again. So she sat in her chambers, surrounded by cushions, for days. Finally, too weak to resist, she let them carry her to bed. She couldn't speak, could barely move, but she was lucid, aware, present until the very end. Someone asked if she wanted James of Scotland to inherit. She couldn't speak, but reportedly gestured yes. Or maybe she didn't. Sources conflict, but it didn't matter. James was the obvious choice. The council had already decided. Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace. She was 70 years old. She'd ruled for 44 years, longer than any English monarch except her grandfather, Henry VII. Her last words are unknown. Some sources say she went quietly. Others say she died refusing to name James until the very end. Still controlling the narrative, still refusing to make anything easy. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the same vault as her half-sister Mary. The two women who'd hated each other, who tried to destroy each other, finally sharing a tomb. The inscription above them reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." It's almost poetic. Almost. So what do we take from this? What's the point of spending 2 hours digging through the childhood horrors of a 16th century queen? Because Elizabeth's story isn't just about her. It's about what survival costs, what power costs, what it means to be a woman in a world designed to destroy powerful women. Elizabeth survived because she learned to be harder than anyone else, colder, more controlled, more willing to sacrifice everything: love, trust, vulnerability, human connection, for survival. She never had children, never had a real marriage, never let anyone close enough to truly know her. She spent 45 years on the throne and died alone. Successful, powerful, legendary, but alone. And that's what her childhood taught her. That closeness was dangerous. That love was a weapon. That the only person she could trust was herself. So she built walls, lived behind them, ruled from behind them, and never ever let them down. She was called the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, good Queen Bess, but she was also the girl whose mother was beheaded, who was molested by her stepmother's husband, who survived the tower, who learned that survival meant silence and strategy, and never ever showing weakness. Her reign was called the Golden Age. England flourished, defeated the Spanish Armada, explored the New World, produced Shakespeare, became a power to be reckoned with. But Elizabeth herself, she was the product of trauma, of survival, of a childhood spent learning that everyone could be taken away. That power was the only protection. That vulnerability was death. She turned those lessons into a reign, a legacy, an icon that would outlast her by centuries. But she never healed, never recovered, never became the person she might have been in a different world. A kinder world, a world where little girls whose mothers were executed got therapy instead of thrones. That world didn't exist, so Elizabeth became what she needed to be, what survival required: a queen, alone, powerful, unbreakable, and still somewhere deep inside, the little girl who watched everyone she loved die and learned that the only way to survive was to never love anyone again. Let's talk about what Elizabeth never said, what she never admitted, what she kept locked behind those walls for her entire life. Because here's the thing about childhood trauma. You can survive it. You can build a life despite it. You can even use it, turn it into strength or strategy or success. But you never fully escape it. It lives in you, shapes you, defines the choices you make even when you don't realize it. Elizabeth never talked about her mother. Almost never. There are a handful of references in her letters, carefully neutral. She kept a ring that opened to reveal miniature portraits. One of herself, one of Anne Boleyn. She wore it always, never took it off, but she never spoke about the execution, never acknowledged what it meant to be the daughter of a woman murdered by her father, never processed, in any public way, what that loss did to her. She couldn't. Because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability was death, so she just carried it, silently, for 70 years. She never talked about Thomas Seymour either, never publicly acknowledged what happened in Catherine Parr's household. The interrogations after his arrest were the closest she came, and even then, she said, as little as possible, admitted nothing, revealed nothing. Did she think about it? Did it haunt her? Did she have nightmares about mornings when he'd come into her room, too close, too familiar, too everything? We don't know. She never said, never wrote about it, never told anyone. She just stopped letting men touch her, surrounded herself with them, advisors, favourites, courtiers, but kept them at a distance, used them, controlled them, never let them control her. And she never talked about the Tower, never wrote about those 2 months when she was 20, imprisoned, waiting to see if her sister would execute her. Never acknowledged the fear, the isolation, the certainty that every day might be her last. She just carried that too, used it, let it make her careful, cautious, paranoid even. She trusted no one completely, not Robert Dudley, not William Cecil, not anyone, because she'd learned in the Tower that anyone could turn on you. That survival meant keeping everyone at arm's length, that the moment you trusted someone completely, they could destroy you. So she never did. For 45 years she ruled alone, made decisions alone, carried the weight alone, and she was brilliant at it, one of the greatest monarchs England ever had. But she was also deeply, profoundly isolated. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but it rings true, that near the end of her life, one of her ladies-in-waiting found Elizabeth standing in front of a mirror, staring at her reflection. She was old by then, 70, her face lined, her hair thin, her body failing, and she reportedly said, I am tired of it all. Not the throne, not the responsibilities, just all of it. The performance, the walls, the endless, exhausting work of being Elizabeth, of never letting anyone see weakness, of never ever letting her guard down. She'd spent 70 years being the person survival required her to be, and she was tired, but she couldn't stop. Because stopping meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. So she kept going, right up until her body gave out. Here's what haunts me about Elizabeth's story. Not the executions or the betrayals or the political intrigue, but the question underneath all of it. Who would she have been if her mother hadn't been executed? Who would she have been if Thomas Seymour hadn't come into her room? Who would she have been if Mary hadn't imprisoned her in the Tower? Who would Elizabeth have been if she'd been allowed to be human instead of a survival machine? We'll never know, because that Elizabeth never got to exist. She was erased at age 2 when Anne Boleyn's head rolled in the grass, replaced by a girl who learned that love was dangerous and power was everything. And that girl became a queen, a legend, an icon, but she never became whole, never became the person she might have been in a kinder world. Instead, she became what survival required. Hard, cold, brilliant, ruthless, alone. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that trauma makes you stronger, not that suffering builds character, but that survival costs something. always. And sometimes, what it costs is the person you might have been. Elizabeth survived, she triumphed, she ruled for 45 years and defeated empires and became a legend. But she also spent her entire life behind walls, never let anyone truly know her, never had children, never had a real partner, never allowed herself the vulnerability of genuine human connection. That was the price. That's what childhood trauma cost her. Not her throne, not her power, not her success, her humanity. And the truly tragic part? She probably didn't even realize what she'd lost, because she'd lost it so young, before she even had a chance to know what it felt like to be safe, to be loved unconditionally, to trust someone completely. She grew up in a world where survival meant control, where vulnerability meant death, where the only way to be safe was to be powerful, and powerful meant alone. So she became that, perfectly, completely, for 70 years, and she was brilliant at it. One of history's greatest success stories, a woman who took the worst childhood imaginable and turned it into a legendary reign. But success isn't the same as healing, power isn't the same as peace, and surviving isn't the same as living. Elizabeth survived, magnificently, but I'm not sure she ever really lived, not in the way most people mean when they talk about living, not with joy or spontaneity or genuine intimacy or trust. She had power, she had control, she had success, but she didn't have connection, not real connection, not the kind where you let your guard down and let someone see you, all of you, even the broken parts, because showing the broken parts meant admitting they existed, and admitting they existed meant acknowledging that she'd been hurt, that she'd been vulnerable, that she'd been powerless. And Elizabeth could never admit to being powerless, not even to herself, especially not to herself. So she just kept going, kept performing, kept being the Virgin Queen and Gloriana and Good Queen Bess, kept being the icon instead of the human, until she died. At 70, alone in a palace, surrounded by courtiers but not by anyone who truly knew her, because no one truly knew her. She'd made sure of that, had spent her entire life making sure of that. It kept her safe, it kept her powerful, it kept her alive, but it also kept her isolated in a way that's almost incomprehensible. 70 years of wearing masks, of playing roles, of never, ever being fully seen. That's what survival cost her. That's what childhood trauma took. Not her intelligence, or her strength or her capability, but her ability to be vulnerable, to trust, to connect. And maybe, in a world as brutal as Tudor England, that was the only way to survive. Maybe there was no alternative. Maybe if Elizabeth had been softer, more trusting, more open, she would have been destroyed like so many other women before her. Maybe the walls she built were the only reason she lived long enough to become a legend. But it's still tragic, still a loss, still something worth mourning, even as we celebrate her strength and her achievements and her incredible, improbable success. Because Elizabeth deserved better. The little girl whose mother was executed deserved better. The teenager molested by her stepmother's husband deserved better. The young woman imprisoned in the tower deserved better. She deserved a world where survival didn't require sacrificing her humanity, where power didn't require isolation, where being a woman didn't automatically mean being prey, but that world didn't exist. So Elizabeth became what she needed to be, built the walls she needed to build, sacrificed what she needed to sacrifice, and became a legend in the process. Just never a whole person. So what do we do with this? What's the point of spending 2 hours as examining a 16th century queen's childhood? Maybe it's this. Elizabeth's story is extreme, but the pattern isn't. The way trauma shapes us, the way survival requires sacrifices, the way we build walls to protect ourselves and then can't figure out how to tear them down when we're finally safe, that's universal. That's human. That's what happens when the world hurts you and you have to keep going anyway. Elizabeth just did it on a royal scale. Her trauma was executions and tower imprisonments instead of smaller, more ordinary betrayals. Her walls were dynasties and iconography instead of just emotional distance. Her success was a 45-year reign instead of a career or a family. But the mechanism is the same. Get hurt, build walls, survive. Never fully heal because healing requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like death. And maybe the point is just to see it, to recognize it, to understand that even the most powerful, most successful, most legendary people are still just humans carrying their childhood hurts, still shaped by what happened to them before they had the tools to process it, still making choices based on lessons learned when they were too young to know there might be other options. Elizabeth became a queen. Most of us don't. But we all become something, some version of ourselves shaped by what we survived, by what we learned, by what we sacrificed to keep going. And maybe understanding Elizabeth's story, really understanding it, not just the highlights and the glory, helps us understand our own stories, our own walls, our own sacrifices, our own ways of surviving that might have outlived their usefulness but are so deeply ingrained we don't know how to live without them. Elizabeth never figured out how to tear down her walls, never learned to trust, never allowed herself real vulnerability or intimacy or connection. She died alone, powerful and legendary and alone. But maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can look at her story and see both the triumph and the tragedy, see that survival is amazing and important and worth celebrating, but also recognise what it costs, what we give up, what we lose along the way. And maybe, if we're lucky, we can figure out how to survive without sacrificing everything. How to build walls when we need them, but tear them down when we don't. How to be strong without being isolated. How to protect ourselves without cutting ourselves off from genuine human connection. Elizabeth couldn't do that. Her world didn't allow it. Her childhood didn't prepare her for it. Her survival required total, absolute, permanent control and isolation. But maybe we can. Maybe we can learn from her strength and her tragedy, from what she accomplished and what it cost her. Maybe we can honour her by doing what she couldn't, by surviving and healing, by being strong and vulnerable, by protecting ourselves without losing ourselves. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that trauma makes you stronger, not that suffering is somehow noble, but that survival is possible. That you can live through terrible things and still build a life, still accomplish things, still matter. But also that survival alone isn't enough, that what we're really reaching for is something beyond survival, something Elizabeth never quite achieved despite all her success: wholeness, connection, the ability to be both powerful and human. Elizabeth was powerful, one of history's greatest monarchs, but I don't think she was ever fully human. Not in the sense of being whole, being connected, being seen, and that's the tragedy underneath the triumph. She won. By every measurable standard, she won. She survived her childhood. She claimed her throne. She defeated her enemies. She ruled for 45 years. She became a legend. But she never got to be just Elizabeth, just a person, just a woman with thoughts and feelings and vulnerabilities and connections. She had to be the Virgin Queen, had to be Gloriana, had to be the icon, always, forever, until she died. And maybe that was enough for her. Maybe she looked at what she'd accomplished and decided the cost was worth it. Maybe she died satisfied, proud, at peace with her choices, or maybe, in those final moments, staring at her reflection, saying, "I am tired," she wondered what it would have been like to be someone else, to have lived a different life, to have been allowed to be human instead of legendary. We'll never know. Because Elizabeth never told us, never told anyone. She kept her secrets until the very end, kept her walls up, kept her control, kept being the person survival had required her to be. And she was extraordinary at it, one of the greatest survivors in human history. But surviving isn't the same as thriving, and legendary isn't the same as happy. Elizabeth I survived her childhood, became a queen, changed history, but the little girl who woke up the day her mother was executed, the one who didn't understand why everyone suddenly stopped looking at her, that little girl never got to heal, never got to be safe, never got to discover who she might have been in a kinder world. She just got to survive. And surviving, as Elizabeth proved, is enough to change the world. But it's not enough to heal it. Not even your own small piece of it. And maybe that's the real secret Elizabeth kept. Not the politics or the strategies or the carefully managed image, but the simple, human truth that surviving isn't the same as living. That winning isn't the same as healing. That power can protect you from everyone except yourself. Elizabeth spent 70 years proving you can survive anything, absolutely anything, and build an empire in the process. But she also spent 70 years proving that some wounds never close, some lessons never unlearn, some walls once built never come down. And maybe recognizing that, really seeing it, is the most honest way to honor her. Not by pretending she was invincible, not by turning her into a symbol or an inspiration or a lesson in resilience, but by seeing her as human. Flawed, damaged, brilliant, tragic, triumphant. A little girl whose mother was murdered, who survived, who became a queen, who changed history, but who never, ever got to be whole. That's Elizabeth I, survivor, queen, legend, and somewhere underneath all of it, still the 3-year-old girl who woke up the day her mother died and learned that everyone you love can be taken away. She never forgot that lesson, never recovered from it, never moved past it. She just turned it into a 45-year reign. Thanks for staying with me tonight. If you made it this far, I'd love to know what surprised you most about Elizabeth's story. What do you think about the cost of survival? Whether you see yourself in her walls or her strategies or her absolute refusal to show weakness. Drop a comment, let's talk about it. Because Elizabeth's story isn't just history, it's human. And maybe, somewhere in her tragedy and triumph, we can find something that helps us understand our own. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, more looks behind the legends, more truth underneath the icons, more reminders that even queens are human, and that being human is always, always complicated. Sleep well or don't. Sometimes the truth is too heavy to sleep through. Sometimes you need to sit with it. Let it change you. Elizabeth never got that luxury. She had to keep performing, keep surviving, keep being the queen instead of the person. But you do. You get to sit with this, think about it, learn from it, and maybe, just maybe, figure out how to survive without sacrificing everything. Elizabeth couldn't do that, but maybe we can. Good night. And remember, surviving is extraordinary, but healing is revolutionary. Elizabeth survived. That's why we remember her, but she never healed. And that's the part we should never forget.